So what if the story you think you know about the very start of Islam, the conquests, who the early leaders really were, those first interactions with Jews and Christians, what if that wasn't quite the whole picture?
Yeah, what if there were other clues? Early historical fragments, maybe, that
Wow.
if you look at them a certain way, suggest something. Well, pretty surprising. Something that maybe challenges the traditional narratives.
That's exactly what we're getting into in this deep dive. We're looking at the arguments from a specific academic work, Hagarism, The Making of the Islamic World, by Patricia Crone and Michael Cook.
Right, and their whole approach was based on looking closely at early non-Islamic sources. So things like Syriac chronicles, Christian sermons, even Jewish apocalyptic writings, stuff written right around the time of the conquests. What did they say?
And our goal here really is for you, the listener, to get a handle on this particular, sometimes quite controversial perspective from the book. We're basically going to walk you through the core claims Crone and Cook make based on the evidence they see in these early texts.
Yeah, and we need to be upfront, This view definitely pushes back against some well-established narratives.
Absolutely. So we're exploring their interpretation of these historical fragments, just trying to understand their argument, you see. We're not saying this is the history, but more like, let's see what this alternative perspective actually looks like.
Think of it maybe as a shortcut, a way to grasp this pretty fascinating academic counter-narrative that comes from digging into sources maybe outside the usual spotlight.
Okay, right. So let's start with what's probably the most striking claim right off the bat. Crone and Cook argue that some of the earliest sources hint that the Arab conquest was initially understood, well, within a Jewish messianic context. What does that actually mean?
It's pretty remarkable, really. They point to sources like the Doctrina Jacobi Nuper Baptizati. It's an early Christian text, polemical, written in the 630s. And it seems to portray the Arab arrival as being seen, at least by some Jews, as fulfilling prophecy.
Fulfilling prophets.
Yeah, this idea of a coming kingdom of Ishmael, and that this kingdom would play a specific role, especially concerning Edom, which is usually taken to mean the Byzantine Empire. They were looking for a redeemer figure.
And this links straight to Umar, the second caliph in the traditional timeline.
It seems to. The authors highlight evidence that Umar was known by the name al-Faruq. Now, later Islamic tradition gives this term various Arabic meanings, like one who distinguishes or says the people of the book called him that. But Crone and Cook argue its original meaning, probably borrowed from Aramaic, was closer to the Redeemer.
Umar, the Redeemer. I mean, that's a completely different feel from the just administrator figure we usually hear about.
Exactly. And some actions attributed to him in these early sources kind of fit that mold. His entry into Jerusalem, for instance, seen perhaps as a messianic act.
Wow.
There's even a source they discuss, an apocalypse called The Secrets of Rabbi Simon ben Yohai, which seemed to give him the job of, well, restoring the temple in Jerusalem.
Wait, hang on. Restoring the Jewish temple, that's huge. So how did that name Al-Faruq change if it started with such a powerful, maybe Jewish-influenced meaning?
Well, according to Crone and Cook's argument, as the movement evolved, as it started to carve out its own distinct identity, separate from Judaism, that original Aramaic messianic sense of al-Faruq maybe got lost, or perhaps deliberately downplayed.
Okay.
Later traditions still had to explain the name, right? So it was given a, let's say, safer Arabic, meaning the one who distinguishes truth from falsehood, or it was attributed to non-Muslims, as if they called them that, and it just sort of slipped onto the tongues of the Muslims.
So a way to distance the tradition from the potentially awkward early connotation.
That's the interpretation they offer, yeah. An effort to sort of neutralize that early messianic link.
Okay, so if the beginnings were framed, even partly through this Judeo-Messianic lens, what did that actually mean for relationships on the ground with Jews and Christians during those early conquests?
The sources they look at suggest a really interesting asymmetry. Crone and Cook find evidence pointing to quite close early ties between the Arabs and Jews.
Close ties.
Yeah. They even bring up the famous Constitution of Medina, which is actually found within Islamic tradition itself, where it states that Jews and the believers form one community, a single ummah.
One community.
It suggests a level of, intimacy, maybe shared purpose in those very early days, something that seems quite different from later periods where the lines were drawn more sharply.
But that's not the picture for Christians at the same time.
No, starkly different, according to these early non-Islamic sources. They paint a picture of, well, significant hostility towards Christianity initially.
hostility like?
Like, there's a contemporary Christian sermon they cite that talks about Saracens burning churches, smashing monasteries, defiling crosses, saying terrible things, blasphemies against Christ and the church.
Right.
And another early account, this one from Mount Sinai, also mentions a real violent hatred of the cross among the Saracens.
And you mentioned that Armenian source quote before.
Yeah, that one really drives the point home, doesn't it? An early Ishmaelite ruler is shown challenging the Byzantine emperor, basically telling him to give up on Jesus because, and this is quoting the sources the authors presented, Jesus could not even save himself from the Jews.
Wow. That's pretty pointed.
It really underscores a specific, marked hostility towards Christianity that the authors argue is consistent in these early texts. And, that seems to clash with the later traditional Islamic story of tolerance for both Jews and Christians right from the start.
Fascinating. Yeah, this early picture feels quite different. The book also mentions some issues with chronology, right, based on these early accounts.
That's right. The authors point out that some later traditions try to link the movement's origins to things like Jewish refugees coming from Edessa. Crone and Cook find this geographically a bit tricky and also chronologically difficult if you stick rigidly to the traditional 622 AD start date.
So what do they suggest instead?
Based on their reading of other sources, they propose that Persian-occupied Palestine actually makes more sense as a starting point for these interactions between Jewish refugees and Arabs. And that, in turn, might imply a slightly later beginning for the whole movement than tradition usually holds. It's just another piece they see as challenging the standard timeline.
Okay, so wrapping up this first part, we have this really unexpected early snapshot emerging from their sources. A movement possibly seen through a Jewish messianic lens. A leader may be viewed as a redeemer, closeness with Jews, but real hostility towards Christians.
Yeah, exactly. A complex and definitely non-traditional starting point based on their reading of those early non-Islamic texts.
Right. Okay, so let's move on then. How did this movement, starting from that, unexpected place, begin to shape its own unique identity? Because obviously they couldn't just stay as a sort of messianic offshoot of Judaism or simply conquerors hostile to Christians forever. That had to change, right?
Exactly. The whole situation evolved. As the Hagarenes, that's the term Crone and Cook often use for this early group, as they solidified their conquests, they seem to have broken with those early Jewish partners.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly they're ruling over huge numbers of Christian subjects.
Ah, okay. A new reality.
Totally. And in that new reality, the intense initial hostility towards Christianity seems to have softened over time, roughly from, say, the mid-7th century onwards.
Is there evidence for that softening?
Yeah, they point to sources like letters from the Nestorian patriarch Ishoyab III, around 647. There's another Nestorian writer later in the century, and a Coptic text, too, the life of Patriarch Isaac of Rakoti from the 680s.
And what do these say?
They mention more, let's say, benevolent attitudes from the Arab rulers towards Christians, even orders being given that favored them sometimes. Which, makes sense. If you're governing large Christian populations, you'd expect some kind of pragmatic adjustment, maybe even a doctrinal softening regarding Jesus.
Okay, so they become more pragmatic rulers. But that must have created a new problem, right? How do you actually forge a distinct religion when you've kind of popped up between these two massive established traditions, Judaism and Christianity? How do you stand apart without just getting swallowed up by one or the other?
That's the core challenge they faced, yeah. This seems to be a crucial period for identity formation. And the authors argue a key move was invoking the God of Abraham.
Abraham. Why him specifically?
Well, it allowed them to present their monotheism not as something totally new, but as a return to the original pure faith, the ancestral faith of the Arabs themselves going back before Judaism and Christianity split off. Abraham was the perfect figure, universally respected, predating both Moses and Jesus.
And they linked specific practices to him. Abraham's commandments.
Apparently so. They cite that Christian source, again, the Syriac disputation between a monk and an emir's follower. It identifies Abraham's commandments, which were also mentioned in that early secrets text we talked about as being circumcision and sacrifice. So this suggests Abraham wasn't just a theological ancestor figure. Invoking him also helped give monotheist legitimacy to existing Arab practices.
And where does the term Hanif come in? That's often linked to Abraham in Islam.
Right. Crone and Cook have a really interesting take on Hanif. They suggest its origin and use here are quite revealing. They argue the word was actually borrowed from the surrounding cultures in the Fertile Crescent, where it originally meant something like pagan.
Pagan, really?
Yeah, and then it was sort of repurposed turned on its head, you could say, used to describe adherents of this simple, pure, Abrahamic monotheism. So it cleverly makes a religious virtue out of what might have been seen as a pagan past, linking it directly to Abraham.
That is clever, taking a word for pagan and making it mean true monotheist. Okay, so Abraham provides the ancient roots, but where did they get a model for, like, their religious structure or their law?
The authors propose that Samaritanism might have offered a useful template here.
Samaritanism. Why them?
Well, think about it. The Samaritans were also monotheists. They had split off from mainstream Judaism centuries before, but they hadn't become Christians either. They'd managed to create their own distinct identity based on their own version of scripture and practice. They offered a kind of model for being neither Jew nor Christian.
Okay, I see the parallel. But how did the Hagarenes actually connect with the Samaritans? Was there direct influence?
It seems to be more conceptual. The figure of Moses was central to both the early Judeo-Hagarism and to Samaritanism.
Right.
And the authors find a clue in that same disputation text, the one between the monk and the emir. The monk apparently classifies the emir's faith as a Pentateuchal religion. And crucially, the emir demands proof for Jesus' divinity only from the books of Moses, not from the later prophets.
Only from Moses.
Exactly, which aligns perfectly with the Samaritan view. They accept only the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, Moses' books, and they reject the later prophetic books that the Jews accept.
Ah.
So this suggests to Crone and Cook that Samaritanism might have provided a kind of blueprint, how to build a monotheism that breaks from Judaism by focusing intensely, maybe exclusively, on Moses and the Pentateuch.
That's a really specific, interesting connection. And focusing on Moses then naturally leads to the idea of needing their own prophet, right? A prophet like Moses.
Precisely. That seems to be the next logical step in building this distinct identity, developing an Ishmaelite prophetology, aligning their own prophet Muhammad with Moses.
So like a new Moses.
In a way, yeah. The authors talk about a shift within this Mosaic paradigm they seem to have adopted. Initially, the focus might have been on Moses the Redeemer, leading the Exodus, like across the Red Sea.
Okay.
But then the emphasis shifts towards Moses the lawgiver, the bringer of revelation at Mount Sinai.
Okay.
Muhammad could then be presented not just as a leader or even a Messiah figure, but as a prophet receiving revelation, completing that parallel with Moses the prophet.
And the word Furqan comes into play here.
They argue it symbolizes this shift perfectly. Furqan becomes a name for the Quran later on, but the word itself seems to have evolved. Its original Aramaic root apparently points towards redemption.
Redemption, like Moses in the Exodus.
Exactly. But in Arabic, it took on the meaning of revelation, or maybe criterion, something that distinguishes truth from falsehood.
Ah, from redemption to revelation.
Right. That change in meaning perfectly mirrors the movement's own shift in focus, they argue. It solidifies the alignment with Moses as a prophet who brought divine scripture.
Okay, so let me see if I've got this stage. They build an identity anchored on Abraham as the ancient ancestor. They use Moses as the key prophetic model, maybe focusing just on the Pentateuchal aspect, like the Samaritans. And they potentially use Samaritanism itself as a kind of structural guide for being distinct from both Judaism and Christianity.
It looks like a really creative process, doesn't it? Borrowing, adapting, repurposing existing ideas and traditions to construct something new, something distinctly Arab, built on the foundation of their conquests.
Okay, so they've forged this identity. They're now rulers of this huge, sprawling empire. How did this newly formed identity, this new religion, actually interact with the, incredibly sophisticated cultures and knowledge systems of the places they conquered? Persia, Byzantium.
Right, that's the next big piece of the puzzle in their analysis. And one striking point they make is about sacred geography. It seems like it wasn't fixed right away.
What do you mean, like Mecca?
Yeah. Crone and Cook suggest the location of the Hagarene sanctuary, which later gets firmly established as Mecca, might not have been the only or even the primary sacred site initially.
Really? What makes them say that?
They mention some archaeological hints from Iraq and also contemporary written evidence from Egypt. There's a writer, Jacob of Edessa, who apparently states that the Maghreb, their term for Hagarenes in Egypt, prayed facing east towards the Kaaba, which geographically points more towards northwest Arabia than Mecca.
Ah, interesting.
So their conclusion is that Mecca becoming the single undisputed center probably happened later, maybe as the identity fully crystallized.
And the whole story of the Exodus got reworked, too.
Radically reworked, they argue. Remember that early idea of a Jewish ingathering to Palestine, led by a redeemer?
Yeah.
Well, the new Hagarene narrative that develops, that gets flipped. The Jewish ingathering becomes a story about Jews being expelled from Arabia by a Muslim caliph.
Wow, a complete reversal.
And the Exodus story itself, instead of being tied to the conquests, it gets relocated within Arabia. It really looks like a conscious effort to create their own distinct sacred history and geography, often by inverting or repositioning earlier narratives.
So it sounds like this whole evolution involved deliberately moving away from those potentially redemptive origins we talked about in part one.
That's a major argument the authors make, yes.
Yeah.
They believe Islam's later development essentially involved a negation of those redemptive beginnings.
How so?
Well, the focus shifted. Instead of returning to a promised land, it became about establishing political capitals in the lands they'd conquered. Think about Muawiyah setting up in Damascus, not going back to Muhammad's original base. And the idea of a messianic figure like Umar the Farouk, that shifts towards a focus on law, on legalism, on a kind of historically detached justice, maybe represented by the Mahdi figure in later traditions, or even towards spiritual resignation like in Sufism.
And that's different from Judaism.
Quite different, they argue, from the persistent, concrete hope for a future messianic restoration that remains central in Judaism.
Okay. So how did this movement actually deal with the cultures they conquered? Ruling over these ancient civilizations, Byzantium, Persia, was it like, say, the Germanic tribes taking over the Western Roman Empire where a lot was lost?
Fundamentally different, according to Crone and Cook. In the East, the actual imperial structures, the administration, the high cultural level, much of it survived the conquest.
Okay.
And that survival allowed for this massive transmission of learning. Hellenic learning, Greek philosophy, science, medicine, it all passed into the Islamic world. But the Hagarenes engaged with it in a unique way.
How is it unique?
Well, unlike the Christian idea of being in transcendental exile, where Christians could engage with pagan learning because their true home was heaven, giving them a kind of detachment, the Hagarene exile was very much of this world. They had conquered this world, which paradoxically might have created a stronger sense of estrangement from the cultures they now ruled.
So they didn't just absorb everything, they were selective.
Very selective. Definitely not wholesale absorption. Roman law, for example, they largely rejected, even condemned it using the term quinun, seeing it as foreign profanity. That shows a clear boundary being drawn against a very powerful external tradition.
Okay, no Roman law. What about Greek philosophy and science? That's huge.
That was more complicated. Pure Greek philosophical ideas, metaphysics, logic maybe seemed difficult for the early religious scholars to digest. The authors sometimes even call them rabbis in this early context.
Rabbis. Interesting term to use.
Yeah, reflecting that potential early closeness or modeling. Anyway, they saw Greek philosophy as maybe impersonal, elitist, foreign. So the mainstream religious tradition tended to resist or reject it. However, the more practical, substantive sciences, like medicine, astronomy, astrology, that was different. That stuff was more easily accommodated.
How did they accommodate it?
Often through concepts like the Son of God, the idea that God has reliable, predictable habits in how the universe works. Even if they didn't fully buy into the Greek idea of independent natural laws, they could see patterns.
Okay.
So Greek medicine, for instance, even though pagan, could be integrated. And it eventually got transformed into what became known as prophetic medicine within Islam.
Right, I've heard of that. What about Persian influence? They conquered the Sasanian Empire?
Yeah, Persian culture was definitely influential, especially ideas about kingship, dynastic rule, the structure of the court, statecraft, aristocratic social order. Very important.
But was that accepted easily?
Again, a bit of pushback, because it wasn't Arab. And there was this drive to create a distinctly Arab past and identity. But still, a lot of Persian administrative practice and courtly culture clearly got integrated. It shows that ongoing negotiation, between their own developing identity and the world they now ruled.
And finally, do the authors link any of this back to the later split in Islam between Sunni and Shia traditions?
They touch on it briefly, yeah. They suggest the two branches maybe took different paths in how they dealt with political authority, or also how they engaged with these external intellectual traditions like Greek thought.
In what way?
They propose that Shiism might have been relatively more open to Greek philosophy, perhaps more accommodating to non-Arab elements within the empire. They even make this rather provocative comment calling Iran's eventual embrace of Shiism a felicitous historical accident within this whole complex picture of cultural interaction.
Okay. Well, this has been a really challenging but definitely fascinating deep dive into the perspective Crone and Cook present in Hagarism.
It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. We've gone through their argument for these early origins, possibly tied up with Judeo-Messianic ideas, that surprising picture of initial closeness with Jews, but hostility to Christians.
Right. Then the whole complex process of forging a distinct identity using Abraham, Moses, maybe Samaritan models.
The reshaping of sacred geography and history, and then that really selective way they interacted with the cultures they conquered, absorbing some things, rejecting others.
Yeah, it's a complex picture they paint. And it's absolutely vital to remember, like we've said, this is one very influential academic interpretation based on their specific reading of these early, often fragmentary, non-Islamic sources.
It's a powerful counter-narrative, though, something to definitely consider alongside the more standard accounts of how Islam began.
Absolutely.
So after digging into all this, what's the final thought to leave everyone with? Crone and Cook described these early Hagarenes as, what was the phrase? A religiously parvenu nation.
Yeah, like newcomers on the religious scene.
Right. Daring to build this whole new faith, a new prophetology, based on their Ishmaelite identity. And they faced just immense challenges, didn't they? Defining themselves against these incredibly powerful ancient traditions, Judaism and Christianity, while also trying to build and run a massive, diverse empire.
Huge obstacles. Integrating or rejecting knowledge, managing different peoples.
So given all those obstacles, what does their eventual success, because it was undeniably successful, creating this enduring new civilization, what does that tell us about, the dynamics of how religious and cultural innovation actually happens, how it can persist against what seem like overwhelming historical odds?
That's a great question to ponder, isn't it? What does it take to build something truly new and lasting in the face of all that?
Something to definitely mull over.